Romans chapter 7, please. Romans chapter 7, verse 14. Okay, I'm going to read from 14 to the end of this chapter. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. For I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh, for I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the thing I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law, waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. Maybe you can tell that I'm kind of struggling as I read. I'm still getting used to the progressive lens, and I don't get the clarity as I should. So I'm still kind of doing this as I read. But it's good to be with you and be able to preach through the book of Romans along with Pastor Jang-won. I must say that it's been quite a bit of learning experience all over again for me as I've been studying through Romans in order that I may preach the message with conviction, a certain amount of assurance that I am standing on a good ground, that I am not giving you false information, I'm not misleading you, and so on. I think it's quite a bit of responsibility for preachers to do this well. So, if I may, I will ask you again, please pray for us as our brother prayed for me, in particular in the leading for worship, a prayer for worship, because it is a very big responsibility. If I say this is what God said and what I've just have done is giving you wrong information about the passage, and that's a very scary thing. So please do pray for me. It's not easy. Yet here I am. What we have before us is a passage that probably is the most controversial one in the book of Romans. One of the few, I would say maybe the most controversial. And you may wonder, why is it controversial? I mean, it looks straightforward enough for me. It's some sort of description about it's a description about a kind of tension that is going on in a person's heart or a person's mind, a person's life, and it seems pretty clear, and that's what it's trying to describe. What's the controversy about? The controversy is about whether this is a struggle that belongs to one who is already regenerate, meaning one who was already saved by God's grace and whose heart has the effect of the work of the Holy Spirit, someone who is in the fold of the gospel of Jesus Christ on one hand. The others who would argue against that would say, no, this is not about a Christian. This is not a Christian struggle. If anything, this is a pre-Christian struggle. This is struggle that belongs to someone who has not yet come to know the gospel, who is still living under a reality that is outside of the gospel of grace. So, I mean, you kind of have to figure out, how do I decide between these two options? In fact, there are many other options too. If well, I don't want to go into all the details, but I could at least identify 4 or 5 different ways of interpreting this passage that I've at least been exposed to somewhat, some more than others. But I would say those 2 are the most historically, very obvious ones that's been kind of colliding with one another in terms of, who's right and who's wrong. Now, when you have a passage like that, that the division of this kind of interpretation is rather pretty even. So it's not like dominantly this and just a few saying that, but it's almost even, and that also the good people, very trustworthy pastors or teachers or theologians have fallen on either side. When you have a situation like that, what do? I mean, do you preach this as if nobody knows kind of scenario, or do I preach it like, well, I stand on this, even though the other side may have some validity? Or if I dare bring you maybe another option of looking at this passage, this is really not about that, but something else. One might say, how dare you do that? What audacity it is that you have to stand today on 21st century a particular point in time and say 2,000 years of history of interpretation, I go against them, but I do my way. So it's a bit of a struggle. I have to tell you, it's not easy. So I want to share this struggle with you first, that there's a great deal of humility as I approach this passage. So even though I will say, I think this is what it's saying, I also want to come to it with a bit of humility. Actually, there should be a lot of humility. One traditional side, of course, is to see this as a struggle of a believer, and who stand on that side is none other than the Augustinian tradition, Augustine himself, and late Augustine at least, and then John Calvin, who is undeniably one of the most influential theologian, pastor, missionary that stands in our tradition. And people along that side have said, well, this is a struggle of a believer. John Calvin, in his commentary of this passage, would say, the way Paul presents an unbeliever is what we have in chapter 1 and 2. They wouldn't even have this struggle. They would be so given away to sin, even if they think that they're having struggle, it couldn't really be a genuine struggle. So the fact that there is this struggle between good and evil, this sense of battling against indwelling sin, itself is already a sign that one who's struggling in this way is a believer. Okay, so that's his side of argument. But the other side would say, well, look at verse 14. It says, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. Now, that's a very strong language. Sold under sin. Sold under, that's a slavery language, right? When you are sold under sin, what does that mean? That means sin is your Lord. Sin is the one who has lordship over you. And how can that be describing a Christian? A Christian is not somebody who is under the slavery of sin, but Christian is someone who has been lifted out of that slavery because now you no longer serve sin, but you serve Christ. So this gotta be something before being a Christian. Now, I set it up this way, and I have a difficult task of giving some guidance to you, what seems to be the right way to go. And the way that I would like to take is actually take it more in terms of narrative of Romans. In other words, Paul's writing not this particular portion in isolation from other portions, but he's writing this portion as a continuation of his presentation, right, of this letter to Romans. So he did start with chapter 1, and he's continuing on. And I may say to you, now this should make you feel like you really want to listen to next sermon next Sunday. You should. Okay. Pray about next Sunday's sermon, because if somebody messes up that sermon, that's a real blow to the Roman series, because That's a lot of pressure on the guy who's preaching next Sunday. I won't tell you who yet. So if that chapter 8 is the climax. It's the great orchestra of God's grand salvation to us. So chapter 8 is where you have the answer to burning question of what's really the this gigantic orchestration of God's wonderful work of salvation for us. Okay, chapter 8. If that's what's coming up, we don't want to give that away at the end of chapter 17. It's chapter 7. In other words, I don't think Paul's yet gotten to the answer. He's not getting yet to the answer. He's still setting up. He's still climbing up to what? The final climactic orchestration in chapter 8. You will hear a grand song of victory when you get to chapter 8. There's now no condemnation, etc. You will get to that part. But end of chapter 7 is not already a full description of where we are now. This got to be something that's still setting up towards chapter 8. So that's one thing that I want to think about. So I don't want to say that chapter 7, verse 14 and the following is describing the fullness of where we are today. Now I say that to pose a problem. I think when I surveyed a lot of the preachings of so-called well-known preachers around this time who have preached on this passage, at least the people that I know, many of them have fallen on the side of this is a Christian struggle. Okay, well that's fine. This is a Christian struggle, but it's said in a certain way that sounds very, how should I put it, very romantic. And I'll tell you what I mean. When you are introduced to a passage like this where the preacher says, look, I know you're a believer, but you still have to deal with this serious problem of indwelling sin. You still have to battle this sin until you die. That's the reality of things, really. But that's what this passage is saying, and the passage is telling you how fierce this inner tension is. Human beings are very complex. Their heart condition is very complex. So I understand where you are. You're struggling. You're struggling with your unbelief. You're struggling with your lust. You're struggling with your greed. You're struggling with all these things. Of course, it's all there. You still have it. And I understand that you're struggling with this, right? Every day is a struggle. So just accept it. Even Bible tells you, even Paul said, your present condition is this struggle, this tension. Now, what do I mean that this is somewhat romantic? Well, if you remain there, right, if you take the gospel to say at the end of the day, well, it's a state of tension that we're in. Well, it's true, there is such a thing as an eschatological tension. Is chapter 7, 14 to the end of the chapter talking about that tension, the eschatological tension? If you set it up as that and say, this is where you are, and it's fine to be there. It's okay to be there. It's only right to be in that place. It's only proper that you're struggling every day with sin in this way. You almost feel defeated. In fact, you feel defeated because you are under the dominion of sin in many ways. But that's how we are. That's how you are. You guys are just not good enough to really get over this. But accept it. This is who you are. When you hear that, you feel like, oh, I'm understood. My deep tension is understood by this passage. This passage is great because it talks about my insufficiency right now. And that's how I am. That's how I am as a Christian. I struggle. I'm a struggling person. Praise God for that. That's what I am. If Kelvin tells me I'm struggling because you are a Christian, not because you're not, praise God, that's a sign that I'm a Christian. Okay? What I mean by romantic is that romanticism is this. Romanticism is you have longing, but that longing is never fulfilled, right? That's romanticism. Romanticism has this idea of the ideal, the great beauty, the great truth, the great goodness. But you never attain it. You never get there. So you have this state of what? Kind of always having this sense of nostalgia. Nostalgia of what? Something that you've lost, yet you never have. You will never have here. So it's there, you aspire for it, you long for it, you desire it, but you don't get it. So you live this kind of, sorrowful, kind of bitter, a little bit resigned, somewhat cynical, somewhat, reserved, yet you kind of enjoy that. You kind of enjoy it. Why? Because, that's what the reality of life is. You may love somebody, but you really don't like that person 100%. Romantic sounds like you love somebody you really love. Well, romanticism actually says the person who you think is so beautiful, in your heart is only 99% beautiful. There's still that 1% missing. And you have this sense like, I'm still lonely. I'm still not fulfilled. I'm still not satisfied. But that's okay. That's what life is. Don't worry about it. Just enjoy that sense of, I don't have it all. That sense of being displaced, this sense of loneliness. I think you can fall under that situation with this passage if you simply see it as a Christian struggle and that's it. Okay? I am like it. I sin. So we can easily fall into kind of shallow legalism. I'll call it shallow legalism because you basically say, if that's the case, I'm just going to try my best. And if I try my best, if I don't make it, what can you do about that? There's nothing much I can do because we're not supposed to make it anyway. Okay? I'm beginning to have issue with that. Now, I'm certainly not going to present you with a perfectionistic scenario. I'm not going to say, well, you know what, if you have Christ, you shouldn't really struggle. Because we do have the eschatological struggle. We do have the last day struggle of already saved but not fully done yet. But that comes up in chapter 8, not chapter 7. You still have to wait for that. It's in chapter 8, not chapter 7. So I'm talking about chapter 7. I'm talking about this passage. What do I do with this? And I think Paul's building up. Let me tell you this, okay? So this is what I think it is. Chapter 7 is highlighting two things, okay? First thing it's highlighting is the power of sin in you, indwelling sin. Last Sunday, the passage was about the one man, Adam, and how he's sinning, and therefore the entrance of sin and death into the world has affected you and me. Sounds really unfair. What have I done? Nothing. Well, at least to contribute to that sinning, yet the result of that sin affects me. But it's not so unfair because the other side is equally true. One man, Christ, living a perfect life and dying a death of a martyr in a sense, yet he assumed upon himself the fullness of sin for me. And because of his so-called substitutionary atoning death, the effect of that man's obedience in life and death had affected me fully. Yet I have not made any contribution to the death of Jesus. I didn't do anything for Jesus when he died on the cross. I had nothing to do with it, cut and dry, nothing. Yet what Christ had done had fully come to affect me. Is that fair? Well, it's equally unfair. But this kind of representation, sort of covenantal representation, and therefore the result of what we call the imputation of sin and also imputation of grace and righteousness, this is equally in effect in us. Chapter 6, Paul says, well, your job is to reckon in your head, dead to sin, but alive to Christ. That's what you have to do, cut and dry in your head. Okay? That's what you need to think. Christian needs to think like a Christian. And the way we think is that we are dead to sin, but we're alive to Christ. That's a portion of what faith is. But then that's not all. That's not all. You get into the deeper experience of your humanness, and Paul's getting into it. End of chapter 7, or in chapter 7. If you get deeper into it, you realize that, wait a minute, sin is not something that is just there outside of me, but sin dwells inside of me. There's an indwelling sin problem, and that this sin is kind of a power. Okay, that's what we have here. The sin lords over you. It's a power. And not only that, in this passage, constantly Paul says it's the law of sin, which means this sinness or this sin thing is not loose or random, but the sin is well organized into a system. It's a law. It's a principle. You have to understand that part, or else you will miss it all, right? So what Paul is trying to say here is, hey, sin is not only something that's objectively out there, but sin is something that's indwelling, and as that sin indwells you, this sin has sense of lordship. This sin has power. This sin has some level of its own authority. There's a sense of organized wholeness to this. There's a principle. There's energy. This sin that dwells in you, because you are you're heirs of Adam. You live in this world which is inherited from Adam down and on to this day. Every human being has this domineering of sin in you. That is an organized power that exists inside of you. Now, to be saved means to put a serious dent to this law of sin, this principle of sin, this power of sin. And Paul would obviously take it to the cross and kill it, right? And he's done it once already, but just reckoning it is one way. But we also realize that there's the reality of this principle at work in us, and what do we do with that? What do we do with that? What do we do with that? And Paul is addressing another issue as well. Okay, there's that indwelling sin, but there's also the issue of the law. He talks about the law already from the beginning, right? And he will talk about the law as something that is good, something that is even holy, a law that is something that is spiritual. It's given by God. See, Paul was a very strong legalist. At one point in his life, he thought that law was it. Law was the answer to every problem, right? And this law is given by God. Given by God through Moses. And how can you deny that? You cannot. And Paul says, law is good. Law is holy. But law is not enough. Why isn't law enough? Because the purpose of the law is not to cure you from sin, but the purpose of the law is to identify sin as sin. It is to tell you that you are sinful. So where there is law, you know that there is sin, because the law reveals the sin. Law identifies the sin. Right? So law is good because it's given by God, yet that law can kill you. Why? Because the sin takes the opportunity of the law and affects you in ways that's despairing, because you realize, I'm such a sinner. There's a sin in me that I can never overcome. And it's the law that identifies that problem. So these two things, indwelling sin and the law, are the two items that's struggling in this latter part of chapter 7. Now, this is not too difficult to understand because we've all gone through this. Okay? When the pandemic hit us, year 2000, I remember vividly, I would have just come back from a trip to Seattle, Washington. And that's when the first big outbreak happened in the US, in a nursing home. So I had just left that. And I flew into LA, and then the next outbreak happened in LA. And then I arrived here, and people were in panic. They're saying, Pastor Park, you shouldn't come to church because you went to all these places. I came to church anyway that Sunday. But then it didn't take very long for people to really take this problem very, very seriously because it was fatal. People were dying of COVID. But remember what we faced in the beginning? There was no vaccine. There was no cure. There's no drug to cure it or even, help you, initially anyway. They were testing different things. But soon there was one thing that came out that was supposed to at least help us to a degree, and that was what? The test kit. Okay? In the US, for a period of time, even test kits were not enough, right? So we had to kind of get just a few at a time. Remember that? Certain countries had a very high outbreak of COVID, and when you go back and kind of think about it, why did that happen? Why was there such a high outbreak? It was because they were testing more. Because through testing, you realize that you have COVID. If you don't have a test, you have symptoms, but you can't really tell that's what it is. So how does test help us? Test help us to know the problem, but it doesn't solve the problem. That's not too hard to understand. I remember the day. It could be, probably was the year end. What year was that? Was it 2020 or was it 2021? I think it's 2021. Saturday before the first Sunday of the new year, so 2022 maybe. Our youngest son tested positive at home. So the big question was, do I go to church next day or not? So I called my staff, hey, my son tested positive. And they said, please don't come. Don't show up. So that Sunday I didn't come to church to preach. Why? Because we knew COVID was going around in our household. But what does that do to heal you? Nothing. So what Paul here is talking about at the end of chapter 7 is the problem of sin and the relationship of law to that sin. What law tends to do is intensify that sin. It makes sin truly sin, but it doesn't solve the problem. Okay? That's what we have. That's the tension. That's the tension of something that is good in me, goodness, that is, it identifies what is healthy and what is not. You know that. You know the difference between good and evil. You know the difference between right and wrong. But the problem is, it has no power to cure your wrong. So it ends up giving you more sense of guilt and shame. It doesn't deeply affect your spiritual life. It makes it worse. Okay, I told you this is only like a half of a sermon because the full sermon happens next Sunday. Right? This is a good place to end and just give you this sense of suspension, right? Suspense. What is it? Wow, so what do we do? What do we do? See, you got to come back next Sunday. You got to come back next Sunday. But I will close with this, though. I will close with this. Now, so is the law good? Well, it's good. You need it. In a sense, it identifies sin. But I think there are a couple ways that this legalism can work, okay? First, I said there's such a thing as a shallow legalism. Now, what do you have to do with the law of the Old Testament? We know it because we're Christians. We read, we know what the Ten Commandments are, so we kind of know what it is to a degree. I mean, we may not study it like Paul studied it, but we know it. So it does affect us. But for many of us, shallow legalism affects us profoundly in our culture. Shallow legalism is, I know what's decent, I know what's good, I could live by that enough to know that I'm not really doing any harm to other people, so what's wrong with that? Okay? In a Korean culture, which is highly affected by Confucianism, and Confucianism is about the relationship, between the king and the subject, between the father and the son, husband and wife. It's not so bad when you think about it. There's the obligation to obey on one hand, but there's also the obligation to be a good model, a good leader. You gotta be a king has to become a good model of humanity to the subjects. A father needs to be a good model of humanity to the children. You don't like to think of husband and wife relationship as a hierarchy, like Confucians have done, but still there is a sense of mutuality. And then there is the principle, the 5 principle, the principle of love, the principle of proper mannerism, the principle of faithfulness, the principle of knowledge, the principle of something else. I think there are 5 and I'm missing one and I can't think of it. But anyway, there are these principles that are very genuine. They're really, really good. If you can live with those principles, it's good. And I see so many people inside church, outside the church, who would say, you know what? I've lived a decent life. I didn't cheat anybody. I didn't really make it hard for others. I live a life that is, basically good enough that I keep myself in good line, on the line, and I don't go to the right or to the left, and I don't really give anybody a hard time, so what's wrong with me? Now, remember I said inside the church and outside the church, this kind of mannerism, this kind of relational mannerism, this kind of Confucian doctrine, affects people so much so that they're Christians to the extent that, well, I'm a Christian because I need something more, not fundamentally to challenge where I am, but just to be more. More of what? Well, I want to make sure that when I die, I want my soul to go to heaven. Or about things that I cannot control in life, such as disease and maybe a bad luck, maybe a financial loss, a death of a loved one. I want these things to be kept, protected from these things by what? Asking God, Lord, help me that I may be in good health. Help me that I'll be financially okay. Help my job to hold. Help my workplace to, not go under. Help my investment so that, I won't lose it all in this bad economy. So you pray about these things because these are things that you cannot help, and you put it under the sort of domain of your faith. But all the rest, you say, I'm okay. So in a church, you have a whole bunch of people that they all think they're okay. So what happens? They fight. How do they fight? They fight because they're on the right and the other must be wrong. And a lot of fighting is about, why do you violate this relationship? There's no proper manner here. Okay? My son does not obey me. Well, the son would say, my father is just an angry man, and I manage the relationship, but I don't really love him like I should. But what can you do? That's who he is. So there's this kind of constant excuse and sort of acquitting of oneself by saying, I'm okay, you're not. In fact, we're all okay, then what does that mean? Oh, we have a pretty nice church because everyone sort of behaves. People know what to do. They don't do anything really off the wall, like certain other churches, people do off the wall stuff. People here don't do that, so we kind of get along with everybody. No one's really off the chart. We sort of, no one's really mad and angry and, psychotic, and, we could manage it. We're okay, right? So that legalism says Christian life is basically the civility plus anything that we can control, asking God to help us. Now, is that Christianity? That's the question I'm bringing to you, right? For a lot of us, maybe it's not Confucianism, but the modern day notion, okay? So this is like the French Revolution and on. And it's the assertion of human rights, assertion of individuality to a point where only thing that really matters is a matter of tolerance. The only morality that we these days really talk about is tolerance. You need to be tolerant of everyone. Everyone has the right to be who they want to be. So you should accept everybody as who they are. We do. Oh, wow. We have such a civil society. We have such a civil home. We have such a civil church. We have such a civil small group. Why? Because we like to be with one another. Why? Because we don't really, do anything crazy. We just like to be with each other because we sort of soothe one another, saying, you're good enough. I'm good enough. We're good enough. Why do we pray? Oh, time to share. Oh, you know what? I have this really hard exam coming up. Could you pray for me that I will concentrate, that I'll do okay? Okay. Oh, you know what? My brother is struggling with this sickness, this disease. Would you pray that he will overcome it? I'm not making fun of those prayer requests, but when you think about it, the extent of your religion is like, we're all okay. It's just that these things we need some help, so let God help us. God helping us. That's shallow legalism. Shallow legalism says, basically, we're decent, we're okay. There's no real problem here. Paul here, in this particular section, is not talking about just shallow legalism, which probably he had some issue too in his own life, because when he was really hot on legalistic righteousness, he thought he was okay. He thought he was really okay. But he also is confessing the fact there's the deeper legalism, and the deeper legalism is because law convicts sin deeply when we become more aware of the deeper reality of sin in us. That's when the law affects it in such a way that it causes us to feel hopeless. This is a deeper legalism. Maybe some of you are there. Maybe you're saying, God, I feel so guilty. I feel so out of it. I'm full of shame because I've sinned. But to be very honest, I think these days you don't really see that either. You don't really see this kind of monastic guilt. You don't really see this kind of legalism to the max. I think you may see a little bit of it when you go to like prison inmates. You ask, what happened to your life? Well, I messed up. I'm a loser. I'm disobedient to my parents. I'm a dishonor to them. I've done my wife horrible things to her. I'm so ashamed to my children. You may see some of that there, but in the larger society, so often we see self-righteousness. We see the sense of, I'm okay. I'm a human being. What do you expect? No one's perfect anyway. What's the problem? But if you ever get to your spiritual agony, now this is a very important part. If you get to that point of dark night of your soul, when you begin to see the real darkness in your heart that you cannot overcome. There is an organized sin in me that I cannot overcome. I have this deep, deep issue. Sometimes you see that when you become a little more introspective. Sometimes you see it when you know that your sort of private part that has been really doing bad is growing. When the night side of your life becomes more pronounced, maybe you see it more and more, knowing that you are a hypocrite to the heart. You see that more and more. But I think even that is becoming somewhat rare these days. But if you come through that point, this is where Paul's leading you in this chapter, in this portion, dragging you into this struggle. And then chapter 8, boom. You know, you will never know the joy of the gospel of Jesus Christ if you don't really understand the deeper legalism. If all you're doing is like shallow legalism, all you're saying is, oh, I'm okay, then you don't need the gospel. Why do you need the gospel when you don't have the problem? You understand what I'm saying? But you need to see all your issues as in relationship to this deep sin issue. It's not easy. It's hard to admit it. It's not easy to get there, right? Because you don't want to get there, right? Why are you anxious? Why are you so angry about life? Why are you so detached from people? Well, I manage, I'm okay. You know, I take my anxiety medication and I survive it. Isn't what all the other people going through? Well, doctor told me, Steve, I know you're a pastor, but when you need to take an anxiety medication, don't worry about it. 30% of Americans seem to do it. Because there was a time when I was really going through this kind of emotional issues, right, in my life. So everything became therapy. Everything became disease. Everything became an issue of unfortunate thing that happened in my life. It's not sin. We don't want to be so judgmental, do we? Right? The society does not allow that. You know, when you call something sinful, people say, wow, be careful. You're being so judgmental. That's the society here. Then if that's the case, where's the gospel? Where's the gospel of peace? Where's the gospel of reconciliation? Where's the gospel of rest? Celebration of what Christ had done. Why did Christ suffer so much if we all have to just manage it? See, I'm setting you up for chapter 8, but if you don't really understand what's going on here, then chapter 8 will seem to you very flat. Oh, it sounds good, but what does it do for me? Well, I knew this all along, nothing much. Because I'm in this romantic mode of what? Well, I know I want to be better, but I know I can't anyway. And I got through this anyway. What can I do? That's all there is. Life is such. Do you intensely fight with sin? I know that's hard. That's despairing because often you lose. But do you even do that? So that the gospel will come to you as a power and liberation? So these are the issues that we're facing in chapter 7 of Romans. More questions than answers. Come back next week. Let's pray.